I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Good evening. Smoot Hawley Smoot. A Tariff Act of 1933 was signed into law in spring of 1930. This is the moment historians regard as when the stock market break of 1929 darkened into the Great Depression. The tariffs raised meant that Wall Street did not see a recovery apparent, and world trade now raised barriers between the United States and Europe. It's a long time ago, 1930, but it's generally understood that trade was the piece that made what was a recession and the possibility of a recovery from the stock market break into the Great Depression we're still looking to for explanations of what happened in the 1940s and worse. They're all connected. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com joins me to talk about trade and history. And we're also joined by a longtime colleague of ours who's here in studio, Alan Tonelson. He's an independent economic policy analyst. He blogs at Reality Check. Gordon, what is Doha and what does it have to do with world trade?
Well, the World Trade Organization, which is the global trading body, kicked off a round of trade negotiations in 2001 among about 155 countries. And the idea was that there was supposed to be an enormous deal, including not just manufacturing, but also agriculture. So there was going to be a global deal. Well, today we are no closer to that global deal than they were in 2001. Matter of fact, we're even farther away than we were then. And this is the first time since the end of World War II that a global trade round has failed. And this is going to lead to a number of different consequences, not only for trade, but also for the global economy itself.
Let's connect all the parts of the globe. Alan, a very good evening to you. Thank you for this. We watch China, and Gordon and I report on it routinely, and it bumps along above or below 50 for its HSBC manufacturing number. We see Europe dipping in and out of recession. It has not in any fashion solved the problems along the Mediterranean. We now see the conflict in Ukraine, the standoff, the cold stares between Washington and Moscow. These are not positives. The Doha round, international trade, is that also part of the unknowns right now for the American recovery and for global health? Good evening to you, Alan.
Good evening, John, and it's such an exciting experience to be here in studio. I'm very pleased for the opportunity. We are at a very important juncture in world trade right now because not only has this latest round of global trade negotiations failed, the first such failure, as Gordon has pointed out, since these exercises began shortly after the end of World War II, but world trade growth has slowed tremendously. It used to be, until the financial crisis hit, that world trade would grow even faster than the world economy. And that was a pretty constant relationship for a long time. That spread was pretty constant. The spread has dramatically narrowed since the financial crisis hit back in 2008, and it hasn't recovered since. We've had something of an economic recovery of various speeds all around the world. Not much here, of course, but trade's growth has slowed tremendously, and it's an indication that the world's economic future, at least for the foreseeable future, is not really especially bright. It's hard to identify strong, plausible engines of more vigorous recovery going forward.
Alan, what are countries doing, and now that they're seeing that Doha has failed? How are they adjusting in a non-Doha world?
It's awfully interesting because the World Trade Organization actually puts out studies each year documenting the number of new trade barriers that have sprung up all around the world. And it shouldn't be too surprising, although it does seem to surprise a lot of people in Washington, when the world economy runs into trouble, broadly speaking, the reaction of most countries is not to liberalize trade further. It's not to open their markets further to products from overseas. And in fact, in recent years, you've had not a spectacular growth of new trade barriers, but it's been pretty steady. And I don't really see an end in sight, mainly because even in the best of economic times, most other countries were not that keen on buying American in particular. It was not high on their agenda.
Yeah, and this really means that a lot of these trade agreements that we've been signing up with the rest of the world have really not been to the favor of the United States, as you have pointed out so many different times. Really what we have are a number of beneficiaries of trade, but the benefits haven't been spread evenly.
Right. I think it's not much of an exaggeration to say that the United States is one of a very small handful of the world's countries that really practices free trade for the most part. Obviously, we have our own trade barriers. In the larger scheme of things, they're really chicken feed. Most of our major trading partners, Japan, Germany, South Korea, China, etc., have strong mercantile traditions. They are not into buying American. They're very much into boosting their own exports, but they're not into reciprocity at all. And this has been a huge problem for U.S. trade because trade policy makers keep wanting to liberalize with countries that simply don't share our economic priorities.
Gordon, there's a trade agreement pending, I believe, in the Pacific that has been held up for some time, perhaps by Japanese agriculture. I can't remember what the last complaint was.
Well, there are a lot of reasons why the Trans-Pacific Partnership is not going forward. One of them is a lack of leadership from Washington. And also, we have in this country, to get this through Congress, we have Trade Promotion Authority, which really is a way to sort of ease the way through the approval process. Well, the president has allowed trade approval authority to lapse, and that means that other countries are saying, well, if you can't get your own Trans-Pacific Partnership deal through Congress, why should I negotiate with you? Because I can negotiate with you, but you can't get it ratified.
Let me turn this around, Alan. If we look at, I started with Smoot-Hawley, and now we hear about Trans-Pacific Partnership being held up, despite the fact the president was talking bouncily about that the last time, one of the last times he went to Asia. If we can't get it done, how does anybody ever get any trade agreements done? Because all self-interest could pull it apart. Why favor anybody in another country? You have to get elected, or in some cases you have to maintain your bank account. So why give it away?
This Trans-Pacific Partnership is actually one consequence of the failure of this global round of trade negotiations that we were talking about earlier, because since the global approach is going nowhere, various regions and countries of the world have started to negotiate narrower, or I should say more geographically restricted, trade agreements with one another. One result of that is business around the world has to play by different sets of rules, which can be pretty confusing, as I'm sure you can imagine. But there's another major question that this Trans-Pacific Partnership poses, and that is, should Americans want it to succeed? And my answer is absolutely not, because the approach that the United States has been taking embodies all of the very serious mistakes that we've been making in trying to reach trade deals, really since the end of World War II, with the big difference that these days, in a very slow growth economy at best, it really matters.
TPP, Gordon, this is not including China, is my memory. China's out of this.
That's right. China is not one of the dozen or so countries that are negotiating it. But Japan, it wants into TPP, and that really sets up all sorts of geopolitical considerations for Asia about tying the region to the U.S.
Just because we're going to turn to the American economy next, Alan. Right now, in general, is the U.S. in a mood to raise barriers, to leave barriers, to make no decisions about trade rules?
I don't say Washington is being in much of a mood to raise trade barriers very high. At the same time, there's very little interest in Congress on either side of the aisle in lowering trade barriers further, whether it's reciprocated abroad or not.
Alan Tonelson, independent economic analyst. Reality Check is where he blogs. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. We're going to turn to the American economy next. It fits into the world picture, and there's a very negative number today. It needs a lot of explanation. The report for the first quarter, 2014, is negative 2.9%. Negative. If you look out on a bar chart, there's this great big red blob sticking below the zero line, and if there are two of those in a row, you don't want to know what's next. I'm John Batchelor.